Welcome to the Bare Marriage Podcast. I'm Sheila Ray Gregoire from ToLoveHonorAndVacuum.com, where we like to talk about healthy, evidence-based biblical advice for your sex life and your marriage. And I am joined today first by my daughter, Rebecca Lindenbach.
Hello.
Because we're going to talk about like mother-daughter stuff.
Yes.
Because something happened last week.
It did.
That kind of blew up. And it was exciting because this was the very first time ever
The Focus on the Family actually listened.
Woohoo! Okay,
Yay!
so let us tell you the story. There's a new movie out called Turning Red.
Yes.
A Pixar movie about a 13-year-old, a girl of Chinese origin, I believe,
Yeah,
in
Meilin.
Toronto.
Yeah.
It's just all about coming of age and her relationship with her mom and
Yeah.
stuff. I have not seen it.
We have not seen the movie.
I
Nope.
probably will, maybe when your kids are older. I don't have kids that age. It's not really on my radar screen, so
No.
this isn't about that in particular. What it is about is that Focus on the Family has a side, I don't even know what to
Website.
call it, called Plugged In, where they do movie reviews.
Yeah, and like music reviews and stuff like that too.
Right, and the purpose is to warn parents
About what's in the movie.
about possible problematic elements in the movie so they know what to expect.
Exactly.
And here is what they said under sexual content in the movie. They write, the subject of menstruation turns up repeatedly too. When a panda-sized May hides in the bathroom, her mother assumes that's the issue. She asks May, did the red peony bloom? We also see and hear references to menstrual pads. May's mom also talks with her about the importance of protecting your petals and start cleaning them regularly. We hear references to cramps, and some might hear an echo of menstruation in the film's title.
Yeah.
This and
This is under sexual content.
this is under sexual content.
Yep.
And surrounding this paragraph, the preceding paragraph is talking about
how, like, in essence, the little 13-year-old girl has a crush on a boy, and she draws pictures of him, like, kissing her and him shirtless.
Yes.
And she's horrified by, like, having, sexual thoughts.
Yes.
And then it goes into, and then there's periods. And then she talks about flirting with boys.
flirting with
and-
middle school boys. So around the menstruation thing, there's fantasies and there's flirting
Yeah.
with boys. And so I saw this and I decided, I think I'm going to do something with this
Yes.
because I do not like the idea that we are saying that preteen girls are sexual. Some of you who follow me on Instagram may know that I do this thing called Fixed It For You, where I put up a quote and then I cross out the bad words and I write appropriate words instead.
Yes.
For this one, I actually crossed out the entire thing.
Yes.
So what I did Fixed It For You from Focus on the Family's plugged in movie review of Turning Red under examples of sexual content. The subject of menstruation turns up. We also see and hear references to menstrual pads. We hear references to cramps, and some might hear an echo of menstruation in the film's title. I crossed all of that out and I wrote, psst, teen girls' periods and cramps are not sexual. And then in the Instagram caption, here's what I said. Sneak peek at our stats about teens coming up, but first, cramps aren't sexual. Teen girls' bodily functions are not sexual. We need to stop sexualizing young girls' bodies. Yes, discussion about puberty may be mature, but it isn't sexual. Treating it this way makes it sound like it's all a big secret that we need to be hush-hush about. In our survey of 7,500 women for our mother-daughter book out next year, we found that being embarrassed of your period as a teen made women 5 times less likely to have above-average self-esteem. If teen girls are embarrassed of their periods, they're 55% more likely to have poor marital satisfaction when they marry, and they're twice as likely to have below-average sexual satisfaction. So here's an idea. How about treating normal body functions as just, well, normal? And how about we not sexualize 11-year-old girls? And if anyone thinks cramps are sexual, they have issues.
Yeah, exactly.
So that went up on Instagram and Facebook, and it went really big. It was also up on Twitter. And Focus on the Family actually
Changed
something.
We didn't know it was possible.
I mean, we sent them all our stuff about the book Love and Respect and how our survey found that it was harmful. We
They
sent
did
them
nothing.
hundreds of stories about how that book enabled abuse, and they did nothing. But they actually changed this review. So after my stuff had been live for, I think, about 24 hours, they kept it under sexual content. So they didn't take it out of sexual content, but they did move it to the bottom paragraph so it wasn't surrounded by stuff that was obviously more
More actually about like relationships.
And they introduced it like this: another sensitive subject that Turning Red alludes to repeatedly, and one that is related to reproduction and anatomy, which is why we've included it in this section, is menstruation.
And then everything else is the same.
Everything else is the same. So at least they did a better intro to it.
Yeah. I mean, what I would have preferred is that they move it into like other content, because they do have like an other positive or other negative subject. They could put it in other positive, you know, like, you know, for some people this might be a really big positive, but just so you know, this is something to watch out if you aren't ready for this conversation yet. That they do talk about menstruation as a normal thing, considering every single girl will go through it. Like, that's a good thing to normalize it in a healthy way, and so that part's good. But they didn't do that. But at least they put it saying it's not in sexual content because it's sexy or erotic.
Yes.
Or because it's something that is bad. Because let's be honest here, like, sexual usually means bad in evangelical culture.
Exactly. So they at least did edit it. But anyway, we're going to bring Kyle Howard on to give us his thoughts, and then we're going to be talking about that later. But before we get into that, we just need to bring special attention to the final line in what they said.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I just about died.
Which is, and let me read it again for you. Some might hear an echo of menstruation in the film's title.
Yeah, echoes of menstruation in the film's title, yeah.
Turning Red. My goodness.
Echoes.
Nobody would want to hear.
Even echoes
an
of
echo
menstruation.
Of menstruation. And so we've been thinking, what exactly is an echo of menstruation?
Well, and I read that and I immediately thought that sounded like a slam poetry.
Yes, we did. Because what else could it be?
Yes.
Other than a band name. I do think it might make a good,
awesome, a female pop punk band, Echoes of Menstruation. Or something like that.
It could be. That could work.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of
Like an
Andy.
Evanescence mixed with like Cranberries kind of like band.
I still get vibes from Andy from Parks and Rec, always renaming his band.
Yes, exactly.
but we were also thinking of slam poetry.
Yeah.
And so before we get to the more serious critiques of this, we thought that we should explore Echoes of Menstruation a little bit more.
I'm Rebecca Lindenbach, and this is my spoken word poetry, Echoes of Menstruation. Drip, 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 gush. Sitting in a dark gray stall, holding in my hands the loudest piece of plastic ever mass-produced, the wings on a maxi pad. I open it. Rip, the sound reverberates. It's unmistakable. Everyone in the bathroom hearing my echoes of menstruation. Walk, skip, laugh, smile. I'm 14 years old and John has just asked me to the school dance next Saturday. With a spring in my step, I do a twirl and his eyes light up in horror. I feel the warmth spread, the betrayal, the shame, all over my white jeans. He assures me it's okay, but in his eyes, I see echoes of menstruation. Slam, lock, sit, gasp on the porcelain throne I hover, tampon already in hand as I realize in horror the guest bathroom garbage can is empty. Gilded faucets and monogrammed towels taunt me. I'm the only one here. They'll know that it's mine. I wrap it 20 times in toilet paper, hoping they do not recognize the echoes of menstruation. For generations on generations, women have been bonded by this dot. Period. Aunt Flo, a visiting friend. Does the red peony bloom? We all share, but we must hide it. For we know that if they knew, they would never take us seriously. We know that if they knew, they would say that we are just hormonal. We know that if they knew, they would find us weak. So instead, we cramp in silence. We bleed with a smile on our face because, as Focus on the Family says, we must be warned against even an echo of menstruation.
I am thrilled to have on the podcast a Twitter friend of mine who I am meeting for the first time. So Kyle Howard is a trauma-informed soul care provider from the Atlanta area and just is brilliant on Twitter. I love following him. Kyle, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for those kind words, and thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So to set the stage for all of our listeners, last week I tweeted about Focus on the Family's review of the movie Turning Red, and Kyle saw it and Kyle replied and we got into a little bit of a discussion about that, and so I thought we would just continue it on the podcast. So here we go. What did you think when you read that?
Well, first off, I think it's awesome that my first time talking with you on the podcast is about menstruation. So here we are. And I mean, but seriously, I think that it's important for, at the end of the day, I think that men have largely been the ones that have established biblical anthropology, conceptions of womanhood and manhood and those kinds of things. And so I do think it's important for men to speak and to set the record straight and not just leave that to sisters to do, but yeah. And so I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to talk about these things. As a counselor and as a father as well of two daughters, we watched the movie. There was a lot of different layers to it for us, as my wife is Vietnamese. And so there was some cultural layers to the movie. Then there was some also, as a counselor, as a soul care provider, there were the layers related to trauma and other things. And then there was that element. I thought I did a good job of presenting it. It obviously wasn't something that was a major theme. It was very much more a matter of fact. This is just kind of an element. But then, of course, as expected, and I'll throw that in there were certain faith traditions that took this and ran with it, which again I think would be more or less expected from said faith traditions. And I'll let you ask to elaborate on that. But
Yes. Well, and of course, what really got me, and I haven't seen the movie. I probably will eventually. I'm just in the middle of a book deadline. I don't have preteens right now, so
Mhm.
it's just not a big part of my life. So I know there's a lot of controversy around how it handled dating or fantasy or whatever. And to be honest, I don't care a whole lot right now. What I really cared about was just that they put this idea that it contained, menstrual pads and references to cramps as sexual content. And considering that girls as young as 9 and 10 can get their periods, and 11 is quite common, to label anything to do with an 11-year-old girl as sexual, I find very difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so much of it is rooted. And I was just talking with someone else. My most recent podcast myself is on this subject, on the Gnosticism of Christian counseling that's often prevalent within biblical counseling structures.
Mhm.
And I think that this kind of what we saw with this reaction to this movie, and honestly, as it relates to this, you're not missing much. It's very much just passing note. It is not central to the movie at all. But what you're seeing is kind of, again, just to be blunt, white evangelical faith tradition that is very much Gnostic when it comes to, and I'll explain briefly what I mean by that, when it comes to understanding the human body, and then mixing that with its conceptions of its anemic or underdeveloped conceptions of sexuality, and those things all kind of coming to a head,
Mhm.
and when they are coming to a head, you then have this preoccupation, with that, with as well as this lack of ability to actually think about something like a young girl having her period through any other lens beyond something sexual.
Yeah, and that's really what got to me. Now, Gnosticism, why don't you define it for those people who don't know what it means?
Yeah, so Gnosticism was an ancient heresy in the first century that essentially posited that the human body, or the physical realm, the physical world, was bad or
Mhm.
sinful, and the spiritual realm was not. It was good. And so the Gnostics believed that Jesus was a spirit being. He never actually existed in the physical, because again, the physical is bad, and ultimately the greatest attainment for people would be the glorified body, which would be just spiritual. So they looked at
Right.
anything physical as being bad or negative. And so when you think about biblical counseling, or you think about the church in general, specifically in that tradition, when it comes to mental health, when it comes to the body, when it comes to the bodily expressions, all those things are put in these categories of bad, of being sinful. And the only thing that matters is, again, is the spiritual realm and spiritual realities.
Right.
And so yeah, so that was essentially Gnosticism, and it's kind of a Gnosticism light that guides much of white evangelicalism in its understanding of both the body as well as the spirit.
And I guess that's really what I was coming to, because how you classify an 11-year-old, 12-year-old, 13, or whatever it is, her body as sexual content has repercussions
Mm-hmm.
for how we see those girls. Because to me, as soon as you label what is happening to her body as sexual, you give other people permission to also label her as sexual. And when we live in a church culture which sexualizes young girls, that's really dangerous.
Absolutely, and to take it a step further within the realm of this of the Christian culture that we're talking about here, and I know you know this based upon your writings that there is very much a hypersexualization of women in general, where women the purpose of women is to be fruitful and multiply. And so, you know, the whole barefoot, pregnant in the kitchen type dynamic, it's to manage the home, be fruitful and multiply, and whenever a husband wants sex, to give it. And so the value and the dignity of women is relegated to what she can provide for men, as men go out and take dominion of and fulfill that Genesis 2 call. And so what ends up happening is when you think about something like menstruation, which, you know, as we all know, is a sign more or less that someone can now get pregnant, you know, the whole process. But instead of looking at that as being, okay, you have come of age through puberty where you are now, you know, developing eggs, can become pregnant, your body's going through this process and everything. What ends up happening is, oh, you're of the age where you can now have sex. So instead of looking at it through the complex and beautiful aspects of the capabilities of producing life, of creating life, it's now reduced to this, oh, so you are now at a point where you can have sex, therefore a period is now sexual. And so it's kind of the overflow of how that tradition looks at women in general, but then it's being reduced to how now they look at girls who are going through that transitionary stage. And then when that ends up happening, there's a logic that is the same logic that is shared by pedophiles. This logic of, okay, this girl is of age because she's having a cycle, and because she's of age, that means she's ready to have sex, and it means that I can have sex with her. And so that same kind of logic that takes something like this and morphs it into this, to sexualizes it, it is the same kind of logic, it's the same kind of reasoning that pedophiles go through to justify their predation of young girls. And so it's hugely problematic on so many levels.
And, you know, we were both in that Twitter conversation. There was a lot of pushback, and you and I were both participating in trying to elucidate some of this. But, you know, some of the pushback was, but it is sexual. Like, the period comes because she's reached sexual maturity. So isn't that where it's supposed to be placed? So what did you say to that?
Again, as a theologian, words matter. I deal within the realm of nuance, where words, what do these words actually mean? Not only that, but understanding them within their grammatical, historical context. You know, all that has to play. And so, yes, in a technical, maybe even in a medical sense, we could say that the body parts that are active in the process of menstruation, in the process of PMS, they are related to organs that have sexual dynamics to them in the sense of reproduction. So yes, in a very technical, maybe even clinical sense, you can say that. But how often is the term sexual used in that kind of way when we think about Christian vernacular? We think about the actual enculturated language of American evangelicalism. Never. To be sexual or to be sexualized within that context is talking about, in some capacity, sexual acts. So it's talking about things, especially outside of marriage, that are sinful. And in that, what ends up happening is something like menstruation is looked at as being sinful because it is something that is sexual. And so there's so many things that go into that. And that's when we get into the issues of like hormones and biology and how those things are looked at as being sinful. And so there's so many other layers to that. But what I was essentially saying in relation to your question was that it's important to understand Christian vernacular, or what we call Christianese. And when we talk about something being sexual, we look at a movie review and there's a category for sexual. And when you have things talking about things that would more sense be reasonably placed under that category, and then you go ahead and put something like menstruation under that category, you're sexualizing it, not in the sense of biology, but in the sense of social and relational engagement, because that's what that whole category presupposes. And so to sexualize something like menstruation is to put something in onto it that is not there, that doesn't belong there, is a completely separate category. And so I would say that, to me, in my mind, a reasonable category would be something like parental guidance. This is and put it there, this is something that the movie addresses, it talks about. This would be a good opportunity to talk to your children about, something like that, rather than putting it into a category where you're sexualizing just normal biological functions that happen with young girls. And as you said, when doing that, you end up putting onto young girls things that assumptions and presentations that should not be placed on them, and it actually places dynamics of danger onto them, because you're sexualizing children, which is highly problematic for what should be obvious reasons.
Yeah, I know. And originally, in their original review before they amended it, that paragraph on menstruation was between two paragraphs of things that were more sexual content, like about fantasy and things like that. So it definitely was between very sexual, eroticized content.
Yeah. Can I ask a side note to that?
Yeah.
So one thing that I would also add is, so I find it a little bit problematic that even those things were placed there.
Yeah, I know. I was going to go there too.
There's still sexualization happening there. So yes, there's scenes in the movie with this 13-year-old girl who's going through this transitionary period. She has a crush on a boy, and she draws pictures of the boy she has a crush on. She draws a picture of him like a merman. So yes, he doesn't have a shirt on and he has like a mermaid tail. And she's obviously into this boy, and is even thinking categories of like Mary and this and the other. Now, most kids, when they get to that transitionary period where they're having crushes on other kids that, typically the opposite sex, but even not even taking that into even a broader category there, it's not, we're sexualizing that, not them. Mm-hmm. A girl having a crush is not necessarily, and most often, not thinking about having sex with the boy. She's going through her emotional and relational processing and development, and in that process, she's developing, curiosities and interests and attractions and everything else. And so there's a massive problem with taking this whole category, a concept of crushes, even crushes where she's drawing a picture of a merman without a shirt on, and then saying, "Oh, this is sexual content." Well, it's like, again, you're sexualizing a crush. And when you do that, when your 12, 13-year-old child comes to you and like, I have a crush, and your response is to sexualize that causes devastation and so much harm. And so even moving beyond that and just looking what other things they put under the sexual content, mm-hmm. I think is hugely problematic, and speaks to the way in which American evangelicalism engages the whole conversation of sex and maturity, child maturity.
Yeah, especially with kids that young. And the other thing that I've noticed in the broader context is that once a girl has physically developed, we tend to ascribe sexual motives to her. When my daughter was 11, a Sunday school teacher took her aside because she was starting to develop and said she was going to have to start watching what shirts she wore to church, because now, adult men would be looking at her. And so she had to be careful not to be a stumbling block. And girls hear this all the time at that age. And what really gets me is this thought that because a girl has a developing body, she is now thinking about adult men in a sexual way. Really, what's happening is adult men are thinking about her in a sexual way, and they're not giving her thoughts any credence. It's like, because the adult man is thinking about the girl in a sexual way, it's assumed she must also be thinking in a sexual way. So it's like she doesn't exist except for the way that we are defining her, that men are defining her and sexualizing her. And I think that's what people don't get, is we ascribe sexual motives to girls merely because other people see the girls as sexual.
And that's kind of getting back to what I was saying earlier in regards to the fact that men typically are the ones who are leading the church, the ones who are developing the theology, when it comes to theological formulations, when it comes to cultural indoctrination, when it comes to all these things, it's largely dominated by men, especially within the specific tradition that we're talking about. We've seen it, right, on social media, how dogged many of these men are to malign and they'll go to any lengths they can to maintain power. And they're the ones who are doing this, and to me, it is profoundly bizarre. Again, just looking at it and being like, why does it seem that we aren't picking up on what's happening here, that these are grown men, oftentimes even in the pastorate or in positions of authority or power, who are sexualizing young girls and setting up this culture that essentially gives them a pass for their own perversions, by blaming their perversions on innocent children, children who are just going through natural development. And it's so problematic, and to me it seems a little petty if you think about it on the surface level, like this movie turning red. This is it's not about the movie just simply was a good way of exposing this much deeper issue, this much deeper problematic issue, because of how people are responding to this movie, something so simple as a movie.
I got into an interesting talk on Instagram with a guy about this because I was insisting that teenage girls' bodily functions are not inherently sexual. And he was saying, well, if they have to do with sex, they are. But my point was, if she's under the age of consent, she ain't sexual. Like you're not even allowed to think of her in that way, according to our laws.
Yeah.
And yet in church, we're letting guys do this.
Yeah. Not to derail the conversation, not to take a rabbit hole, but I would also say that even women who are of age should not be sexualized. You know, a woman should be, and so much so that I would even venture to say that if a prostitute came to church wearing the most scantily clad, attire, she still shouldn't be sexualized. Jesus was able to have prostitutes cry at his feet without sexualizing them, but rather looking at their soul and looking at their inherent worth as image bearers. That should be what the ambition, that should be the ambition of men in the church, would be that there shouldn't be a safer place on the planet for women to be able to go as a place of refuge from the sexualization of their bodies in the world. And what ends up happening is that we have a bunch of churches, entire faith traditions, that there is no place that sexualizes women or girls like the church, like those church buildings, and like the men who lead them. And so that's so problematic that's where we're at, all the way, not only when it comes to women, but then especially when it comes to that there is no age range in regards to when it's acceptable and unacceptable. It's just, anyone who's female can get sexualized, and it's their problem if they do, rather than looking at the people who sexualize them when they're not desiring or seeking to be sexualized.
Yeah. And there is a racial component to this too that I wanted to bring up with you, because we're working on our mother-daughter book right now. And we have a whole chapter on modesty. We've looked at a ton of peer-reviewed research, as well as done some of our own. But you probably know this, but in peer-reviewed research, what they found is that if you look at school dress codes, for instance, African American and Latina girls are singled out for dress code violations at far greater rates, even if the dress is the same.
Yes. Absolutely. That was another component that I was going to mention, because it's very, very prevalent, especially within our racialized society. One of the things it's unavoidable is the fact that white supremacy itself is a sexualized phenomena. When we think about, I was talking about this earlier on Twitter, that and I was talking with my wife about this, that even when we think about lynching, historically, there's been a lot of sanitization that has happened to that process. When many lynchings were done, what actually happened was men and women were stripped naked, men were castrated. There was a sexual violence and white supremacy go hand in hand. And when it comes to the sexualization of Black men, as well as the sexualization of Black women and brown women and brown men, that's always been a component of white supremacy. And so, and literally, there's so much that can be talked about just there. But then, as it comes to this issue specifically, there is a dynamic often at place where people from Central America, people from African descent, when it comes to bodily development, they at times can be seen to be developed at a faster rate, or when it comes to just general development of their bodies that can be more pronounced than certain other ethnic demographics. And because of that, there is a hypersexualization that can happen regarding that development. But I do think that it's linked to two things. I think that it's not just simply the developmental optics, if you would. It also has to do with the way in which sexualization and racialization both go hand in hand. To put it another way, exoticism plays a heavy role in regards to how ethnic minority girls are looked at, where there's automatically seen as being promiscuous. White girls, again, thinking racially, much of the racial violence that has happened over the past several centuries has been in protection of the image of the white pure girl. And so people have been, whether you're talking about Emmett Till, whether we're talking about who was just a boy just minding his own business. We know now because the woman confessed that she made it up, that the idea that he winked at this woman, he was not thinking anything sexual. He was just minding his own business. And this woman sexualized this young boy, leading to his torture and ultimate lynching. And so whether it's young boys or young girls, this sexualization that happens with them is directly connected to this idea of exoticism, that because they're different, because they're ethnically different, and because they're not part of this idea of white pureness, that means promiscuity. And because of that promiscuity, when they're racialized, they're also sexualized. And so Black girls are both racialized, and in that racialization, where they're being perceived as being inferior biologically, they're also being seen as being morally inferior. And so they're also promiscuous. They're also, all these other things. That's comprehensive. Whenever we think about racialization, whenever someone's being racialized, you see this all the time. There's an assertion of biological inferiority, but also social inferiority. Black men make horrible fathers. Black boys are disobedient. Black girls are, disobedient. They have attitudes. They have, there's all these ways in which you both racialize based upon ethnic superiority, but then also moral superiority as well. And again, that the sexualization is part of that aspect of, or the sexualization of, with the assumptions of promiscuity. Fall within those categories. So I think the racial component of this is severe. And it's severe in the sense of not just in the present time of what it does to young ethnic minority children, but also because for centuries it's literally led to the deaths and lynchings of ethnic minority children, especially Black and brown.
And I think one of the key words you just said is children. We are talking about children, and there is never a reason to sexualize children. And I think what you were saying about the assumption of promiscuity is, again, what's happening is that our own thoughts are being projected onto children. So because of the way we see the children, we're projecting those thoughts onto the children, and that's why we're assuming they're sexual. That says far more about us than it does about them, and it needs to stop. So I want to end on a hopeful note, because I know this is all kind of depressing, but like you said, the church should be a refuge. The church should be a place where anybody can come and can feel like they are being accepted and seen, truly seen for who they are. One of my favorite things that Jesus ever said was when the woman was wiping his feet with her hair, and he says to the Pharisees, "Do you see this woman? Like, do you see her?" And I think Jesus just wants us to see preteen girls, and let them be preteen girls.
Absolutely. It's profoundly suffocating, and we wonder why young people are leaving the church. And I would say that many of them, demonstrated by the way that people have responded to like this movie, many of them leave the church because the church isn't safe. They feel safe. They feel and are actually safer in the world than they are behind the four walls of a church building. And that should never, ever be the case. And so we do have a lot of work to do. The fact that there have been a lot of people who watched this movie across various ethnic demographics who said this is great, this is a great movie for children. I think that we are seeing progress. We are seeing growth. We are seeing a lot of Christians and churches that are saying we do want to be a place like this. So I am hopeful. I just think that there are some traditions and some people who are living in a bygone era and are trying to maintain a power structure that is profoundly unhealthy and unsafe for young girls. And I'm glad that the Lord seems to be crushing that.
Yeah. Amen. Yeah. Well, thank you, Kyle. Where can people find you, or where would you like me to send them so they can find you?
Yeah. So again, I'm primarily present on Twitter, at Kyle James Howard. I also have I just launched 2 new podcasts. One's called Quorum Deo. The other one's called Soul Care. Quorum Deo is a podcast that deals with just issues related to practical theology and current events. And Soul Care is a podcast that focuses on trauma-informed soul care, and just different episodes dealing with, case studies and a philosophy of counseling and those kinds of things.
Perfect. Well, I will put links to those in the podcast. And thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it, Kyle.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, that's kind of heavy.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing when you talk about some of these issues, you don't realize how many layers there are to them.
Yeah.
I did bring up that study that you found.
Yes,
actually, for our mother-daughter book.
Yeah, I found this research, and I already knew about it because of my undergrad. In essence, what research has found is that girls who are specifically Latina girls and Black girls are more likely to be dress code violated in their schools, for even if they're wearing the exact same thing or showing the exact same amount of skin as their white peers. Mm-hmm. So in essence, you can have 2 girls who are both showing the same amount of cleavage, one Black, one white, and the Black girl is disproportionately more likely to get dress code violated, even if she's looking the exact same. And it's because, in essence, we've over-sexualized not only girls' bodies, but even within over-sexualizing young girls' bodies, we've even more over-sexualized the bodies of young women who are Black or Latina in particular.
Yeah.
And we tend to add sexual motives to neutral behaviors more often,
right,
with brown and Black.
Yeah,
Young
which is
girls
really
versus
something
white.
to mourn.
It's horrifying.
That is horrifying, and I think, as people who are
white,
I think we do need to
or even
acknowledge
pale
that.
white.
Yeah, and that is something to mourn. And Kyle was talking about white evangelicalism. I know that's a buzzword that
for some people.
But
I do think we need to talk about it because here's the issue. Okay, in evangelicalism in general, we really like to other people, right? So with all this stuff about sexuality, okay, we've considered men to be the assumed norm. Right? So you have these books where it says like men in essence know what to do and women need to catch up.
Yeah,
right?
like active marriage was treating women like they were naive.
Yes.
Because sex was easy for men and harder for women.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right? And so you have these books that assume that because sex is easy for men, it should be easy for women. Or we assume that because men find sex easy, we need to define sex on men's terms, which is why intercourse is usually what we mean when we talk about sex.
Right.
Right? Versus like activity that is done with the express purpose of bringing each other to orgasm, which is actually in sexology the actual definition of sex these days, right? Because they've recognized that painful or uninvolved intercourse is just not actually that sexy.
Yes.
But that's the point, is we've taken men and we've made them the default, and so women are the other. And so, sex hurts for you? Well, that seems like a you problem, right? Like, you can't orgasm? Maybe you should get your head in the game better. Like, there's a lot of different things that are told to women because women are seen as the other in that situation. And similarly, frankly, in our culture, because whites tend to be the majority culture, we tend to be seen as the default. Right? So you have like Black churches, but you don't have white churches. Now you have white churches, but they're not called white churches. Right?
Yeah.
It's churches and Black churches. Right? Which is why we get a lot of people get offended when you say white evangelicalism. But that's just what it is.
Yes.
It's when the white people are defining the culture, it's white evangelicalism. The same way that we have Chinese Missionary Alliance churches, and that's because they are run by Chinese people and have a Chinese culture. And you have Black Baptist churches that are run by Black leadership and have Black culture. And similarly, white evangelicalism is run by white people and has white culture. Does that mean that there aren't any people of color in the ranks? Of course not. But it is dictated by white people and their culture.
Yes.
Right? So that's why we need to be able to differentiate and talk about how they are different. Because otherwise, we see ourselves as the default and everyone else is the other.
Well, and actually that whole other idea has really been coming up in the commentary about the movie Turning Red, because it's about this Chinese girl in Toronto. And so the question is this even applicable to other people? And people are saying it's like a really niche audience.
Well, and then the lashback to that was I always say lashback. It's backlash.
It's backlash and pushback, and you keep combining them.
Oh my word. Anyway, the pushback to that particular review was so funny because people started going out, Finding Nemo was centered around the story of a fish and was set underwater, and so good movie, but very niche audience that it's
Yeah.
really meant for. And so obviously it's like, no, why is it that as we can relate to literal robots in a dystopian future, but apparently we can't expect people to relate to a Chinese family?
Right. And especially a Chinese family with a girl. And this is one of the big issues they've always had with literature too, is that girls will read books about boys.
But boys won't read girl books.
Which is why Hunger Games was such a huge deal when it first came out, because, you know, boys were reading. But anyway, yes, like, so this is a little girl, Chinese in Toronto, which, by the way, I grew up in
Yes.
Toronto and went to school with lots of
Well, I mean,
girls and-
you lived right next to Chinatown.
I
Toronto,
did. So it was lots of fun. So anyway, it was very funny. And Kim's Convenience, by the way, the actual, like, if anyone watches that show, I used to take you there. We used to go grocery shopping, like, right where that is set.
Yeah.
So that was where you were babies. So anyway, but that's beside the point. That's Toronto culture.
Yeah.
Just, and by the way, the way you say Toronto, this is just not part of the podcast, but this is just my Toronto nature, is like, you don't pronounce the second T. It's like Toronto.
It's CHRONNO.
Yeah,
If you're from
how-
Toronto,
that's
it's
how-
Toronto.
Toronto. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
okay, but that's beside the point.
And this is one of the things that I'm personally was quite horrified by in the review. And again, like, I want to reiterate, we are not talking about if the movie is a good movie for your kids to watch. And we're gonna, like, we don't want to have those conversations in the comments. Like, we're only talking about the specific parts of the review.
Yeah, we're really only talking about, like, I know Kyle watched the movie and liked it, but we honestly haven't.
No.
And we don't have any plans to right now.
We have no time.
Yeah, we have no time. We have a book deal,
Yeah.
a book, what is it? We have a book deadline on April 1st. But one of the things that it does mention in the review as well is, do you want to read this?
Yeah, this is one of the things that got me really, really angry, was under spiritual elements. And again, these are things that they're usually, like, warning parents about, like, things
Yeah.
that your parents should know. Okay? They say this: we see people dressed in ways that would indicate other religions, including a Sikh dastar and a Muslim hijab.
Right. So,
Like, so literally, they warn that your child might see a Muslim girl.
yeah.
Like, it doesn't have any information about what Islam even is.
Yeah.
It's just the fact that a girl exists in a hijab, Focus on the Family thinks, ooh, parents should really know about that. And there is a word for that, and I'm going to be very, very forceful here. There is a word for that. It is Islamophobia.
Yeah.
And it is xenophobia. And it is very, very, very wrong. Okay? Like, anyway, sorry. This is something that really, really gets me angry, because I had a lot of Muslim friends in school. And
So did I, actually.
and there
Yeah.
were and there's just a lot of them who, the fact that I wore a cross meant that I had to earn their trust because of crap like this. Like, I'm sorry, but no parent needs to be warned that there's someone who, it's just, as someone who has children, I just see what would I feel if my children were being targeted like that.
Yeah.
Where they thought that the mere presence of my child was a threat to theirs.
Yeah.
They thought that just their children seeing my kids being different from them is enough to warn them, maybe you don't want to watch this movie because there's a Muslim girl in it. Not even like talking about Islam.
Yeah.
But
just
just in
the
it.
presence of a Muslim girl.
And that's why it is important that we do talk about things that are uncomfortable, that call out our otherism.
right.
Okay? Like, so I know this is uncomfortable for some people,
Yeah.
but please recognize that there are real people that are being affected by this. And if we continue to see ourselves as the default, if you're in, like, the same group as us, if you continue to see ourselves as the default, this is what happens.
Yeah.
We start seeing Muslim girls as the threat.
yeah.
It's
And-
just sad.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So I do want to
Yes.
get back to the
Sorry.
period stuff.
Thank you for letting me have my little rant.
That was good. We are working on this mother-daughter book. It is due in on April 1st. And we have so much data that we've been having so much fun going through.
That's really a word. Fun.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's been a lot of work. And
Yeah.
every day we call up Joanna and we say, hey, have we checked this? And we come up with a new stat that she has to try to find and see if it has any impact. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. But we did look, after this Turning Red thing, we did have her look at embarrassment of your period.
Yeah.
Like, how does that, because we did measure it. We just never ran. Like, we measure lots of things. We don't necessarily run stats for everything. And I'm glad we did measure that because we found that has incredible effects later in your life. If you're embarrassed of your period as a teenager, you are twice as likely to have below average sexual satisfaction.
Like, that's a big deal.
You're 55% more likely to be in a really low marital satisfaction category.
You're 5 times as likely to not have good self-esteem.
Yeah, to be in the lowest self-esteem category. Like, this is huge stuff, people. And so we can't raise kids to feel like their period is something embarrassing. And I think what the problem is we have a difficulty around the idea of private versus secret and shameful.
Yeah.
It's okay for something to be private, but when you put it under sexual content, the way Focus on the Family does, you're really saying this is hush hush.
Yeah, exactly.
This is something that should not be discussed in polite company. And you know what? It's just her body. It isn't sexual. Saying that something is sexual says that it's something that's sensual and erotic. And it often does imply how someone else sees you as well.
Exactly.
Okay?
Yeah.
Whereas, like, there are lots of women who are going to have periods their whole lives and never going to have sex.
Yeah.
Like, it's just part of a woman's body.
Yeah.
And our body parts, we shouldn't be ashamed of them. We actually found that the more educated girls are about sex and about their bodies, the less likely they are to engage in risky behaviors.
Oh, and we're not the only ones who found that too.
Yeah, or to have multiple sexual partners. Well, that is a risky behavior, but like, they're more likely to actually do the kinds of things you want them to do.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so empowering them and giving them language for their bodies and giving them language to what's happening to them does not make it more likely they're going to go out and sleep with everybody. Like, it isn't sexual. This is just their body.
Well, and not only that, there have been a lot of studies that have shown that teaching even young toddlers the actual proper names for their genitalia is a very, very good protective factor against childhood sexual abuse. Because if they know what's going on and they know what's happening down there and they know what all their little bits are called, frankly, they're really educated in this stuff and they're more able to tell you when something has happened. They're more, in essence, kind of terrifying to a predator who wants naivete.
Yeah.
There's a lot of protective factors there.
Yeah, remember that when you can't name something, whatever you can't name carries shame.
Yeah.
Whatever you can't name means it's supposed to be hush hush and secret. And by putting this under sexual content, that's what they were saying, is that this is hush hush and secret. You know what's funny is you and Katie, when you were teenagers, you used to work as lifeguards.
Yes, we did.
And this really opened your eyes to a new way of looking at periods and everything.
Well, because it was funny, because I remember it was during my first year that I worked there. So Katie wasn't working there yet. But we used to have this problem where, you know, a lot of us girls were on our periods. Like, you're not supposed to, like, leave the deck, right? Because there are kids who might show up and you're supposed to be there. But, like, you kind of have to go and, like, change your tampon every now and then. Right? And so, you know, a lot of times the guys would just kind of cover for me. Like, if I had to go out and change a tampon, they'd be like, yeah, if any of your kids come in, I'll just talk to them until you get there. Right? I'll make sure no one jumps in the pool. And it was just kind of normal. Like, we even had a box of tampons in the office for a while, like, just so anyone could grab one if they needed one. Like, this stuff was just so normal because we're all in bathing suits and in the water all the time. You kind of have to be able to talk about it, or else like, really awkward things can happen, right? Like, if your male supervisor is like, why are you off deck? It's like, because I have a tampon, okay? Versus like, got it.
Yeah.
You do you. You know? I will be here when you get back.
And it just wasn't a big deal. And
No.
we need to take some of the shame out of this. One of the ways, though, that we contribute to the shame around periods is that we equate it with sex. And this is what Kyle and I were talking about a little bit, but I wanna hone in on this more just as we finish up. Passport to Purity.
Yes.
Okay, so that was a puberty course that was put out, I believe, by Family Life.
It's Family Life, yeah.
And I took you on that when you were 11.
I was 10.
You were 10, okay. But I did that with you. It was a series of CDs at the time, and we were supposed to listen to them. It explained what sex was. It explained what your period was. It explained what growing up meant.
It explained that there was something called sex.
Right.
I'm not really sure how much it explained sex was.
Yes. And there was lots of confusion.
There was much
after.
confusion.
I remember the funniest thing was about the finger.
Yeah, so all I remember, and I know some of you have already heard this because I've said this before, but I just remember them telling, and again, I might be misremembering it, okay? But this was supposed to instruct me. So
Okay.
what I remember does
Yes.
matter. I remember them explaining that a penis was a finger-like organ. And I remember just thinking, well, if they already have a finger down there, then why do they always use their hands to scratch their testicles?
Right. Yes.
Like, I just thought that they could just go like,
Yeah, which is an issue. But anyway, so there were all these CDs. So it was the informational part of your period and sex. But then the majority of this weekend was all of these object lessons I was supposed to give you on how paper could glue together, but then you'd rip it apart, and part of it would be, and how glue got less sticky the more you used it. And so sex, you weren't supposed to have sex with other people. You were supposed to wait for marriage, and I was supposed to get you to pledge to do that.
yeah, at age 10.
You were 10.
Yeah.
And telling a girl that she's about to have her period with now telling her you need to promise me you won't have sex is extremely shaming and problematic.
It's really problematic. I remember I was just quite horrified at learning what sex even was.
And so we didn't even do those exercises.
No.
And when we actually created, this was one of the impetus for us to create our own puberty course called The Whole Story.
Yeah.
Which you can get. Katie and Rebecca are the ones on the videos talking to your daughters about puberty and sex and what it is. And Sheldon Neal, a TV personality from Toronto, and Connor and David are doing the boys' side, your husbands, Connor and David. And we have an older version and a younger version. And the younger version is just the information.
yeah. And then all we talk about in terms of like God's design for sex is not like, make sure you don't have it. It's, I know this is freaking you out. You don't need to worry about this for a long time.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's not a make sure you don't do anything bad. It's a, hey, you need to know what this is, but like this is so not a now problem.
Right.
It's
And
very different than the idea of, and so now you're going to be tempted to lust and you're going to do bad things. You're going to ruin your whole life. Now you harlatan or your 11-year-old.
And again, what that's doing is it's ascribing sexual motives to a girl simply because she now has her period and she knows about sex.
Yeah.
So we're assuming that once they know about sex and they've reached a certain age of maturity, or their body's reached a certain stage of maturity, that now they're going to want to have sex. And to imply that to a girl is really shaming to her.
Yeah, well,
when
and
she's not ready for it.
It's also very confusing, right? Because you're
Yeah.
still a kid. You're still a little kid. And
These girls still play with Barbies. They're 10.
yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I think I was still obsessed with Littlest Pet Shop toys until I was 12 years old or something.
Right.
Like, these are little kids.
And this is the problem with when we think about periods as sexual, we actually do a lot of harm to our girls.
Well, and when I think about all this stuff about how we talk about periods being sexual, is that, like, baby girls have all these parts. Mm-hmm. Baby girls. Like, from the day you are born, you have eggs.
Yep.
You have ovaries. You have fallopian tubes. You have a uterus. It's
Well, actually, the egg for Vivian and Alex were inside of me.
yeah, exactly.
Because all of the eggs that you had
Yeah, that turned into my kids.
that turned into your kids were created inside of me.
Yeah, exactly. Like, these have been around for a long time. Like
yeah.
the idea that, like, you know, Focus on the Family and their review, like, even put the fact they talk about cleaning your labia as, like, a sexual thing. They don't even use the proper terms in the movie. But it's like, you know what? 4-month-old baby girls have a vulva and all the parts that go with that. It's not sexual to have to clean yourself.
No.
It's not. It's not sexual to know what a labia, like what
Yeah.
labia are. It's not sexual to know what a vulva is. It's not sexual to know what a scrotum is. Like it's just not.
And you know, a lot of parents were pushing back, saying that they didn't want their boys to know about this stuff. And in the whole story, we do tell girls what boys go through, and we tell boys what girls go through. Like we do say, now here's what puberty is for the other side. But I just want to say, like, there was one woman who said, when my son is ready to date, I will tell him about periods. Unless your son is dating at 12.
Yeah.
I think you might be waiting a little too long.
Even by 12, like, I mean, I have a very different perspective, I think, than some people. And this is one of those things where, like, you know, we're also okay to agree to disagree with viewers on this, totally. But if your son is in a classroom with a 10-year-old who just got her period for the first time and she leaks through her pants, is he going to know not to laugh?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
what I would ask. Because the problem is that if you don't educate your sons, you're almost enabling them to become bullies sometimes because they don't know. It just looks like she just sat in grape juice. He might not even know that she's bleeding.
Right.
But he laughs at her because he didn't know. And a lot of our very sensitive and nice sons, if they knew that they were embarrassing other girls because they had the information, they would be horrified. So give them the information.
Yeah.
Like if the 10-year-old girl is old enough to know that her period might be coming, the 10-year-old boy is old enough to know too. It's not fair for girls to have to know this stuff first.
Yeah.
When we say we don't want things to be secret anymore, but we want them to be private, I think a lot of people think that if we quote unquote normalize periods, that means we're going to start doing like period blood art from our menstrual cups in the middle of the street. Like that's, we're like, let the free flow freely. Like we're not saying any of that, okay? Like there is a level where there is still such a thing as manners and there is such a thing as propriety. And you know what? If I am going to go to a nice wine and cheese event with a future employer, I'm not gonna be like, oh man, my cramps, my tampon is just sticking me up in all the wrong places right now. Like we're not gonna do that, okay?
Right,
It's
right.
inappropriate. But I think that we can have this understanding that the idea that we shouldn't talk about periods when like you're chatting with someone you don't know that well doesn't mean that it's not appropriate for it to be a part of like just regular media. The same way that like a lot of other embarrassing puberty things are a part of regular media. You know, it doesn't mean that we can't talk about it in families or like it has to be hush hush because your brothers shouldn't know. Like why shouldn't her brothers know? If she needs to know, then like why don't they need to know, right?
So-
like they don't need to necessarily know what brand of tampon your favorite one is, but like it doesn't need to be hush hush.
Yeah. And so, again, if you want your kids to get a new way of learning about this, do check out The Whole Story. I think it's quite well done and it's quite inexpensive. I put it on sale at the beginning of COVID and I've just kind of kept it at that sale price. Eventually, we're going to have to put it back up again. So get it now while it's still on sale because I haven't had time to change the website. That's really what's going on. I just haven't had time to change the website.
There's just so many moving parts.
So, now's a great time to take advantage of my not laziness, just my extreme overwhelmedness and go pick up The Whole Story. It's wonderful. There's kids age 10 to 12 and also, sort of 13 to 14, the younger version or the older version, or you can get both together. And you can even get a complete package with the boys and the girls together of all ages. So go check that out. We will put the link in the podcast notes. And I am now going to let you leave and bring on your dad.
Sounds good.
I have brought my husband Keith on to join the debate. Hello, babe.
Hey, everybody.
So, you're a pediatrician.
Yes.
Let me ask you.
Okay.
Would you have put cramps and menstrual pads under sexual content?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a tough one, right? Because what do you mean is sexual,
Yep.
right? Because, like, it's related to the body parts that are responsible for sexual reproduction. So does that mean it's sexual? I don't think when people read a section about sexual content in movies, though, they're talking about biology.
No,
I
don't
think they're
think so.
talking about stuff like that. So, yeah. So, I mean, so technically, is it sexual? Well, yeah, maybe in that definition, but not, I think, in the standard thing.
Yeah, and especially because, in the original one, before and after, it was talking about, flirting and fantasies and stuff.
Right,
So,
yeah, exactly.
And they didn't put a disclaimer.
No, and it was clearly they're just going into it. It was like very much the idea of, there's talk about menstruation. Oh my gosh, it's sexual. Like it's like like this sort of whole idea, because I think that we tend to think anything that has to do with female. I think we tend to start thinking of it in terms of sexual terms.
Yeah.
It's part of the male-dominated society, I think. The problem is that what that does is it sort of sets women up, and especially girls, to think that things about them that are specifically female are kind of weird or other and that sort of thing. And I know a lot of, like most boys, they get freaked out about the fact that they're going through puberty, but not the way that girls do. And there's certainly not the same level of shame or discomfort that I tend to see with adolescents. Girls tend to be very, very quiet about it. And the problem is that we don't teach enough about how to make girls feel confident in their sexuality, because we sort of have this fear of talking about anything sexually in a healthy way. And so therefore people are just ignorant. I mean, I think of issues of like the classic one you talked about in one of your blog posts about the girl who got a tongue lashing from her youth leader at a camp because she didn't want to do her swim test.
Right.
Right? Because she was having her period, but she didn't feel comfortable saying she was having her period.
Right.
Right? So there's like two major issues there.
Yeah, that one really bugs me, because if you are a youth leader, if you are a male youth leader,
Yeah.
and you have a girl who doesn't want to go into the water,
Yeah.
that should clue you in that maybe there's
Yeah,
a reason.
and that's what I'm saying. There's two issues there. The first issue is that she doesn't feel comfortable talking about natural body functions, and it's sad because there's nothing wrong with. If you have to go to the bathroom, you have to go to the bathroom. If you're having your period, you're having your period. This is not your fault. This is nothing bad. You shouldn't be ashamed of that. But the second thing is the complete lack of knowledge that most men have about these things. So the idea that she was having her period wouldn't even enter his mind because men just don't tend to think that way because it's not something that's taught. And we need to be more sensitive to that.
Yeah, we did a whole series on this about a year and a half ago. So I will put a link to that series in the podcast notes, and we have all the stories of youth group terrible things happening to girls and being embarrassed at youth group about periods. So yes, we will put that. That really does need to change. It really does. As an adult, even you can tell someone I'm going to get a gallbladder operation, but you can't say I'm going to get a hysterectomy.
Oh yeah, do you think there's like stigma about
Oh
that?
yeah, I think there really is. And so we just need to stop it. Like we don't need to be scared of echoes of menstruation.
Oh
okay?
yeah.
So that is our official doctor thing too. That's wonderful. Normally at the end of the podcast, we give some encouragement and we give some reviews that came in for the book. I just want instead to talk again about the whole story, which is a wonderful course. If you are looking at how do I talk to my kids about puberty, or even how do I tell my sons about what girls go through, or how do I tell my girls about, guys' erections and stuff like that. Yeah. You can take a look at the whole story. We will put a link in the podcast notes. Again, it's probably the lowest price it's ever going to be because I just haven't had time to change the page. So it's been on sale for a long time. So go check that out. And until then, we will see you next week for our Start Your Engines podcast and for the finale of all of the podcasts that we've been doing at the launch for The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex and The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex. I know we kind of put that aside for this week just because this whole thing happened, but we have some exciting things to share with you next week on men who are sexually safe. So tune in.
See you then.
And we'll see you then. Bye-bye.